From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is the rapidly increase of knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. Today, though, is an expert series episode. So no guest, but allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you there, Joelle?
I'm not sure. It feels like it's been a long day today.
Feels like it's been a long year.
Yeah, it sure does.
It's only July.
Yes.
Yeah. So it'll be Christmas before you know it.
It will be. It's,
Yeah, what are your plans for Christmas, Joel?
Magic.
Magic?
Creating magic.
Yeah,
that's what I do every year.
You do. The same thing I do every year.
Yeah. Create magic. Yeah, nice. Try to take over the world.
Thank you, right?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for getting my reference.
Yeah. Hopefully we've got some other Gen Xers that can also appreciate it.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Nice. All right. I haven't started thinking that far ahead yet. But
neither have I.
Yeah. Moved house
you did.
last week.
Yeah.
So that was the first time in 18 years. Similarly, I listened to my wife who said, hey, my dad's connected. He's got us a truck. We can just move ourselves. And I know, right?
I told you to hire removers.
I had the number. I'd called the guy, and then my wife's like, oh, no, we can handle it. But she didn't have to lift any of the heavy stuff I did.
Yeah, spoken like someone who's never moved house.
Yeah, well, we haven't in 18 years, right?
Yeah.
So,
and you would have been very young then last time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Probably 6 operations earlier. Yeah. But I'm glad it's all done now and feel pretty much at home. So just got to get rid of the old place. But all good. All right. Well, hey, look, we're not here to talk about our personal lives as much as our listeners love it.
They sure do.
Yeah. But let's talk about
You're going to tell them your address?
No. I live somewhere in the Greater Perth area. So there's actually 3 topics for today that I want to talk about, but they're all kind of related to an overarching theme, which is about influencing key stakeholders in order to progress a psychosocial safety strategy. Because what we see time and time again is that there's, particularly within health and safety, there are people who really get the moral obligation and, they get into health and safety to make sure that when people go to work, they come home as healthy as when they arrived. But often there's difficulty getting other stakeholders on board, whether it's the exec, whether it's other maybe health and safety counterparts, whether it's people from HR, people in culture, that sort of thing as well. And I guess what we wanted to spend some time on today was just to talk around a few things that we're seeing are really moving the needle and really getting stakeholders on board and leading to much faster progression of psychosocial safety strategies. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So someone we spoke to just recently said he was at a recent seminar or conference type thing that Jim Kelly, our friend of the show from Safe Work New South Wales, is on.
Not our conference.
Not our conference. He was also at our conference. He is a good friend. But one of the questions that was put to him as the regulator on a panel of experts was, hey, I'm a health and safety person. There's 700 people in my company. I cannot get the exec on board in terms of our obligations around psychosocial safety. What's your advice? He said, I can send some inspectors around there. And he said it kind of, as a bit of a joke. But, just this week, I had someone who had basically said a month ago, hey, look, Jason, we'd love to engage you. We can't, though. We just don't have the exec buy-in to this. There's no resources. There's no money. We can't do anything. We just have to try and do it ourselves. A month later, he comes back and says, Jason, we need you now. The thing that changed, they got a notice of improvement.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you used to work for a regulator.
I did.
Yeah, tell us, why would a notice of improvement move people so fast?
Because there is legal consequences associated with not complying with an improvement notice. So, essentially, if a regulator issues you an improvement notice, you must comply with that improvement notice. Otherwise, there will be consequences associated with failure to comply. Up to and including having your operation shut down. So, I think a lot of the time when we talk to businesses in the hypothetical about legislative compliance, they tend to respond with, how affordable fines are for different types of breaches of the Work Health and Safety Act, which is true, but typically once you get to a point of receiving a fine, it's, coming off of the back end of a prosecution typically, which comes with, a lot more cost if you're wanting to actually fight that prosecution. But there are a lot of other instruments that a regulator can use that happen well and truly before prosecution or in lieu of prosecution, as is the case for an enforceable undertaking. But, I think different levels of non-compliance lead to different levels of response from the regulator. And what we don't have visibility of with state regulators is the improvement notices that they issue. So we see enforceable undertakings, we see prosecutions, but we don't see anything below that threshold in terms of compliance-related activities. So there is actually, we work with many clients who have had an improvement notice from the regulator, and it is absolutely a mandatory requirement for them to respond to that improvement notice and demonstrate that they've taken actions to bring their operations back into compliance with the legislation. And, in my time at the regulator, we found that, the improvement notice was probably the most efficient way of bringing a PCBU back into a state of relative safety in terms of their operations.
Yeah, and we're definitely seeing that, right? So many frustrated health and safety people. I wonder if they ever, made a call.
I would not be surprised if they had.
Yeah. So when you look at an improvement notice, right, I remember we had this discussion with a client recently regarding, a regulator can't instruct you how to do something, but they can show you where you are not sufficient in terms of your coverage.
Yeah, so what a notice will typically do is point to what elements of the legislation you're not complying with, and it may describe sort of probably not in the notice itself, but the work that's done in advance of the decision to make a notice will include sort of what was the evidence that the inspector reviewed to form the conclusion. But yeah, the regulator in most cases won't actually say, well, you need to do A and then B and then C to rectify this, because we don't have prescriptive work health and safety legislation in Australia. It is objectives based, which is, here is your duty and it's up to you to demonstrate how you're meeting that duty. Then it does come back to the employer to be able to demonstrate how, or to be able to decide what's the strategy that they need to implement to bring themselves back into compliance. That's really where the codes of practice come into it. Depending, I think, on the size and complexity and nature of your business, the codes are sort of varying levels of helpful. I think that the codes for psychosocial are quite broad. So I think if it's sort of getting into the detail of actually how do we deliver this from an implementation perspective, the codes don't really give a lot of good helpful advice from a practical perspective when it comes to psychosocial safety.
Yeah, and that kind of ties in with what we typically see in those improvement notices. So it's usually things like you have no process for consultation or no evidence that you have consulted in this space. You need to know, have identified your key hazards. You haven't got them documented anywhere. You haven't got controls listed. You haven't got any process for evaluating controls. And also training and instruction around psychosocial hazards and how they have effect, and also reporting of psychosocial hazards too, right? Which also then falls under the officer duties around having processes for that. Yeah. So pretty much everything you need to do around psychosocial risk management as a framework is things that we commonly see forming under a notice of improvement. But I guess through a lot of recent examples we're seeing where companies had no, or health and safety people or HR people had no exec buy-in, having a notice of improvement suddenly gets their attention, and all of a sudden they find, resourcing and stuff that there previously was no hope of.
Yeah.
Yes. But there are other ways to get your exec's attention as well, and to progress your psychosocial safety strategy that doesn't involve a visit from Jim Kelly or any of his regulator friends in other states.
Hopefully.
Yeah. Actually, one that I've noticed, and Kim Grady actually from UTS presented on this recently at a safety conference I was at, was around having psychosocial as a critical risk in a critical risk register. So critical risks are typically those things that can kill you, and many people would say, well, psychosocial work demands, well, no, they don't typically kill. I guess there is lots of evidence, though, that yes, actually, they can kill if a worker chooses to kill themselves due to work-related factors. And recently, if you haven't listened to the podcast episode yet that we did with John Fitzgerald from WorkSafe New Zealand, they did a very rigorous evaluation of coroner records, and what they were able to find in quite a robust method was that 12% of suicides were indeed primarily due to work-related reasons. So of all of the suicides that had occurred in New Zealand, there was about 50 every year that could be brought back to being work-related suicides.
And those were very sort of conservative criteria that they were using as well, where it had actually been identified in the coroner's report that work-related matters had contributed. And so they sort of had the view that realistically those numbers were probably higher, but they were taking a conservative perspective in what they were reporting. And when we had Tony Lamortagna on recently talking about his recent publication, he did also flag some additional research that he had been doing with sort of a global research team on this same topic, looking at work-related suicide, and sort of similar findings there, that it certainly is a thing. And I think going beyond looking at suicide, there are certainly other potentially fatal health consequences associated with psychosocial hazard exposure, and they can be things like cardiovascular disease, stroke, those types of things. Some cancers, I think, as well. And then you can look at also, I guess, other types of occupational disease, if you want to call it that, if we're talking about things like post-traumatic stress disorder, major depressive disorder, that can be precursors then to suicidal behaviours as well.
Yeah, and then even just human errors, right?
Yeah.
If you're stressed or not fully focused on a job that requires it, then and that's why fatigue is often one of the critical risks listed by organisations.
Yeah.
So look, what the reason why having psychosocial as a critical risk can be really valuable to progress your psychosocial safety strategy, however, is that when you are having changes brought into your organisation, whether that's a restructure or whether methods of work are changing or processes are changing, basically what you can do as a health and safety professional is go through each of your critical risks and go, does this apply in this particular context? And if so, I need to do a risk assessment around it. So, for example, if you're changing the structure of your plant, then you might need to do noise assessments, you might need to do dust assessments and particulate assessments, that sort of thing. If it involves people, which most organisational changes will, then you would, if it was a critical risk, you would say, well, psychosocial is one of our critical risks. Yes, that would apply. And so therefore we should do a psychosocial risk assessment. So having it framed as a critical risk then gives you the leverage you need to go, well, we need to actually consider the human elements of the changes that we are proposing. And we really need to consider how do we keep people safe if we are, or at least not bring in any extra hazards when we make this particular change.
Yeah, and so again, to link it back to the legislation as well, there is that requirement that you do conduct risk assessments before introducing organisational change where, relating to those sort of reasonably foreseeable hazards. So certainly, I guess regardless of whether you've actually got it captured as a critical risk or not, if you're making organisational changes that are impacting people, then the legislation does require that you conduct a risk assessment on the psychosocial hazards associated with that change and plan how you're going to manage those.
So no, totally agree. That sometimes we know is not enough to move the needle. I guess bringing it up, if we're thinking about elevating this to an exec level discussion, getting their agreement that, it is a critical risk would then obviously elevate the priority that is placed on doing risk assessments in a particular area.
Yeah, and it certainly it gives a greater level of importance, I guess, internally to not only conducting that, but also in terms of paying attention to what the outcomes say and taking action appropriately.
Yeah, because if your execs still believe that, psychosocial hazard exposure at the worst is going to lead to burnout, but generally just leads to a bit of whinging and complaining, that's probably not going to be enough to get them to treat it seriously. But if you get them to really consider this as a critical risk that can actually lead to death, then there's more impetus for them to do something from not just the legislative responsibility, but the moral responsibility as well they have as execs and board members.
Yeah, or the reputational risk.
That's it. Cool. So if you haven't done it yet, that is definitely something that we're seeing is starting to move the needle, and to create that rapid progression of psychosocial safety strategies.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the Flourish DX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow Flourish DX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the Flourish DX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode.
The other thing I wanted to talk about, and we did talk about it recently with Mike Hagan, but I just want to come back to it, is looking at common kind of responsibilities that HR and health and safety have. Noting that often HR will be doing their own thing in relation to workplace mental health, and then health and safety, now that this in Australia in particular comes under workplace health and safety regulations, there is a need to make sure that both are on the same page and working together. And there's two things that we're seeing where this is really important. One is around sexual harassment prevention, because we have overlapping duties from the Australian Human Rights Commission as well as the workplace health and safety legislation. But then we also have psychosocial investigations, which need to go further than just, investigating complaints and, substantiating a complaint, but also looking at what are some of the upstream factors that may have influenced, unsafe behaviours occurring, and how do we prevent that happening within other aspects of our operations. I guess we have spoken a bit, and we have a whole podcast episode that we did on the Sexual Discrimination Act amendments to have the positive duty around sexual harassment prevention. But maybe if you could just give a very brief summary, Joelle, about the similarities and how HR and health and safety need to work together there.
Yeah, so the Sex Discrimination Act, the amendments to that act were really done in response to findings that the existing act as it stood had very little impact on reducing rates of sexual harassment and discrimination in organisations. And when you look at what the legislation required at that time, it's not surprising because all that the legislation required was that organisations were able to respond to occurrences or complaints of sexual harassment. And so what the changes to the legislation did was say, well, it's not enough to have responses in place. You actually need to be taking steps to prevent those behaviours from happening in the first place. And so that approach of actually looking at upstream causes and understanding things like exposure are very much reflective of work health and safety legislation, which is about understanding hazards that have the potential to cause harm, putting controls in place to reduce the likelihood of those hazards actually leading to harm or hopefully eliminating those hazards, as well as then having sort of systems in place to detect and respond if things do go wrong. So from a principles perspective, what we see is that the Sex Discrimination Act is now more in line with work health and safety legislation, in that it's not just about determining whether or not something happened and responding, but it's about saying, well, what are the things that could happen? You know, what are the risk factors within our organisation that could lead to this happening, or could create a situation in which somebody does behave in that way? And then what can we do about those risk factors so that we're reducing opportunities, we're reducing that we're creating a culture in which people don't feel like that type of behaviour is acceptable, or that they can get away with it, those types of things. So, yeah, it's very much around looking at, well, what are the things that might create this situation, and what can we do to address those almost root causes, if you like. So the approach is then very similar when it comes to thinking about how we're going to prevent this, but then also once we get into an investigations perspective, you know, the goal that theoretically the goal in safety investigations is to understand what were the causes and contributing factors of an event, and what, if anything, needs to be changed from a systems of work or a work environment perspective to prevent that type of event from happening again. And traditionally, the purpose of a grievance investigation has been to determine whether or not the thing happened and then apply a disciplinary consequence, as opposed to understanding why the thing happened and might it happen again, and if so, how can we change things so that it's less likely to happen again. So what the Sex Discrimination Act changes have done is required a big shift in HR's thinking about responding to grievance complaints. What are they investigating? How are they investigating in particular? And what are the consequences, or what are the conclusions and outcomes of their investigations? So we've seen some businesses being very proactive in that, and really sometimes actually handing over ownership of grievance investigations to the safety function, because they have that capacity and, I guess, training and mental models to be able to help them look at those upstream factors. You know, other businesses do have HR professionals who are very switched on in relation to these sorts of matters and are thinking upstream already. And then we see other businesses who are sort of struggling to put this into practice. And so, yeah, that's really where the collaboration between safety and HR can be helpful, is in those situations where HR doesn't have the knowledge or the skills or experience, or haven't demonstrated the capability to look at upstream, identify upstream factors, and also think about or develop appropriate mitigations outside of disciplinary consequences.
Yeah, so we're really seeing a need for HR and health and safety to work together in this process to not just, like you say, investigate the complaint and apply a disciplinary process, but to think about those upstream contributing factors to protect more people from similar incidents happening again, whether that be, you know, bullying or sexual harassment in particular is where the focus of the Sex Discrimination Act obviously is.
Yeah, and I guess the big crossover there obviously is that sexual harassment is also a psychosocial hazard. And so there are absolutely safety impacts associated with sexual harassment exposure. We know that often that type of behaviour can escalate if it goes unchecked, so it can actually escalate into physical assault. But in addition, we know that, past a certain threshold of behaviour, sexual harassment can also be very harmful for people's mental health when they are on the receiving end of it, or when they're witnessing it, or when they're hearing about it. And more broadly, the impact that it has on morale for people, knowing that there's somebody engaging in that behaviour in the business and getting away with it, doesn't do great things for a range of employee outcomes and business outcomes as well. There's sort of your human rights aspect to it. There's your work health and safety aspects to it. There's your sort of employee satisfaction and morale, and then business outcomes, reputations, a whole raft of reasons why it's good to understand what are the things that allow sexual harassment to happen in this workplace, and what can we do to change that.
Yeah, so we're seeing a real appetite from our clients regarding how they deal with psychosocial investigations, particularly around matters pertaining to sexual harassment, bullying harassment, that sort of thing. We're running some courses, particularly for health and safety and HR professionals on that, to upskill them on investigations. But we decided to run a webinar, which will be coming out on the Thursday. This episode will come out on the podcast on Tuesday, and then on the Thursday that week, there will also be a webinar on this topic. And I have to say, Joelle, it's the most popular webinar topic that we've ever put up. We had 400 registrations to that webinar in the first 24 hours. Might be because Heather's on it, and she's obviously very good in this particular area, but I think it also speaks to the need for people to educate themselves in this space and to rapidly, I guess, meet what's required now under, obviously, the dual responsibilities under workplace health and safety legislation, as well as the Sex Discrimination Act.
Yeah, and so the two areas that we're seeing real interest in is in upskilling HR professionals to be able to look at those upstream factors in their grievance investigations, but also upskilling the safety investigators internal to the business to be able to consider psychosocial factors that may have contributed to an incident or an event. So in particular, where the event involved human action, so if it's not just something like an equipment failure, we really want to be considering where the psychosocial factors were at play there in that particular action. Because they're going to, as with everything from a conditions of work perspective, if those conditions are there and they're not identified, then they're going to continue to be there and continue to impact on people. So whether that's impacting people's attention, whether it's sort of affecting their mood, a range of different outcomes that we know from a human factors perspective are all going to act as largely sort of escalation factors if we're looking at a trajectory type of exploration.
So there's a big need for that. So there's a number of things we're assisting with. Like you say, we're helping companies internally upskill their people. We're also running investigations as an external or an independent investigator, if you like, to assist that and use that risk lens when doing those investigations versus substantiating a claim. But the other thing that we have considered and now have decided officially, and this is breaking news, to launch, is that we will be running a professional course on psychosocial investigations that will commence on September 19th. So very similar format to our professional practice course that's had such great feedback. There will be 3 live lectures rather than 4 from the professional practice program, which will take you through what you need to know, as well as then giving you some practical exercises in the month in between the live lectures to help you to go away and investigate. How do you actually go about investigations, for example? And also, how do you consider upstream factors? So as part of that, we'll be giving access to FlourishDX tools for small groups of people so that you can use the tool to consider those upstream factors or get familiar with how you would go about doing that using a tool like the FlourishDX Work Factors Risk Assessment. And that will be supplemented by a community of practice that will happen following each of the live lectures, where we want people to really network and learn from other people's experiences in different organisations. And then the main mode of assessment will be through reflection activities, where people reflect on what they learned and the practical application of the exercises, which we found is a really great formula for the professional practice program that we run, which takes people through a psychosocial risk assessment cycle.
Yeah, people seem to enjoy the variation of the format of that. So the combination of the lectures and the communities of practice and the reflection activities, along with access to the tools to get their fingers into it and actually sort of see the practicalities of it rather than just learning about the theory.
Yeah, and it's a big, I think it's a really important thing for people to get their head around. A risk assessment is not just a once-a-year activity, but you should be using it to respond when you need to, either when you've identified hotspots or you have complaints to consider, at that time within a particular department, for example, the upstream factors that may put many people at risk of unsafe behaviours rather than just investigating, one particular incident. So, we're really excited about that course. I'm particularly excited because Heather will be taking the lead on that course rather than myself, so it'll be a bit easier from my perspective. But we're really looking forward to commencing that on the 19th of September. We will be obviously putting out information on how you can enrol in that in the coming weeks. But if you come along to the webinar, we will be putting a link up for expression of interest in that particular psychosocial investigation course that will be coming up shortly. So but seriously, it really amazed me that we had 400 registrations in less than a day to that particular topic when we've run so many other really cool topics, I think, and we haven't had that kind of level of appetite.
It's like afterglow from the conference.
Yeah, maybe a bit of that. Like people just couldn't get enough from the conference and they wanted to dive back into it. I've got so many exciting announcements about PsychCom 2025.
Hold up. You've just made an exciting announcement.
Yeah. I will mention, though, on the topic of sexual harassment prevention, that Dr. Anna Cody, who's the current Sex Discrimination Commissioner, will be one of the people presenting at the conference. She's going to be interviewed by someone yet to be determined, but very high profile herself.
Yes.
So, yes. Cool. But look, really what we wanted to talk about today was, a number of ways which you can influence other stakeholders in your business to more rapidly progress your psychosocial safety strategy. So we've talked about, obviously using legislation and inspectors now. There's a lot more examples of inspectors actually enforcing the legislation, which is really important to get execs on board. Hopefully you don't have to get your own improvement notice to get the execs to give you support, but we know that it does help to progress things rather quickly once that does happen. We talked about, elevating psychosocial risks to a critical risk. If you have a critical risk list within your organisation, because actually going, this is a way that people can die in our operations, then hopefully we'll give it more of the focus that it deserves when you're talking at the exec level about that compared to other risks within your operations. And then we talked about the overlapping duties between HR and health and safety, so particularly around investigations and the positive duty around sexual harassment prevention. And that's really the ultimate way for HR and health and safety to come together on psychosocial factors within the workplace. And obviously ongoing education and developing professional competence in that area is important. And we have the webinar that will be coming up this Thursday, as well as the professional course that will be starting on the 19th of September for those that are interested in that as well. But I think we covered a lot in about half an hour, Joelle.
Well done, Jason.
Well done to you.
Thank you.
So, listeners, we'll be back next episode with a guest, we promise. But we'll be interspersing that, obviously, with some of these expert series from time to time when we've got some interesting things to share with you guys. Cool. So remember, we do record these over video. You probably won't watch this video, but there are other videos on the FlourishDX YouTube channel We'll also take snippets from this and other clips and put them on the Flourish DX LinkedIn page if you want to check out some of the highlights over there. And while you're on LinkedIn, Joelle and I are very happy to continue the conversation, and definitely reach out if you want support in any of the areas that we've talked about today. Thanks a lot. We'll catch you next episode.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychhealthandsafety.com.